One of the favorite books that I got to reread during 2025 was Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace. I read this for the first time when I was 16, and I did not understand really anything about it. However, about 7 years after that, I got to read it again, and worlds exploded. The whole thing lit up. I think a lot of people stay away from War and Peace simply because they've heard it's a great classic, or they've seen how large it is, and that itself has become daunting. But War and Peace isn't about difficulties. It's not about the fact that it's long. I mean, people watch long TV series that go on for years and years, and nobody talks about how difficult it is to pay attention. War and Peace is the same way. It contains a large cast of characters, but not many as people might think, and it's an incredibly action-packed and passionate novel. What I want to do today, however, is just focus on one scene. It's one of my favorites from all 3 times I've read War and Peace, and I think this scene really captures some of the best things in Tolstoy's style. Okay, so the scene that I want to talk about today occurs in Volume 1, Book 1, Part 2, Chapter 20, and this is during the encounter at Schöngraben, and it concerns the cannonade that is set up by Captain Tushin. Now, there's a lot that I need to go over just before I read this scene out loud. Okay, so the background, first of all, is that this is an encounter that takes place a little bit before the climactic Battle of Austerlitz. And anybody who has studied Napoleonic history knows that this was a great victory for the French and a great defeat for the Russians. Austerlitz serves as one of the initial climaxes of the novel, but that occurs several chapters later. What we have right here is a small affair at a village called Schöngraben. And this occurs after Napoleon orders one of his generals to take his army forward and crush the Russians. Okay, so who are the Russians at this point? Well, we have a couple armies. This one is led by Bagration, and serving under Bagration is Andrei, or Andrew Bolkonsky. You'll see both of them towards the end of the scene. We also have Captain Tushin, who is in charge of a cannonade that is defending one of the flanks. They call it a battery. Now, prior to this, we've seen Captain Tushin and General Bagration interact with each other. It was very brief. I'll go ahead and read that section because it shows some of Tolstoy's great power at characterization. This occurs just a little bit earlier in chapter 17. Bagration called to him, and Tushin, raising 3 fingers to his cap, with a bashful and awkward gesture not at all like a military salute, but like a priest's benediction, approached the general. Though Tushin's guns had been intended to cannonade the valley, he was firing incendiary balls at the village of Schöngraben, visible just opposite, in front of which large masses of French were advancing. No one had given Tushin orders where and at what to fire, but after consulting his sergeant major, Zakharenchikov, for whom he had great respect, he had decided that it would be a good thing to set fire to the village. "Very good," said Bagration in reply to the officer's report, and began deliberately to examine the whole battlefield extended before him. Okay, so that's the initial encounter that we have between Bagration and Tushin. I'm not going to read much more what happens between that and our scene because it's not really important to what I'm reading. But one of the things I love is Tolstoy's characterization of Bagration, the haughty Austrian officer, compared to Tushin, who's low, humble, and salutes as though giving a priestly benediction. It's a small detail, but it captures so much about their opposing personalities. So after that encounter, the battle begins to go south for the Russians, and they have been given the order to advance. One of the things that Tolstoy captures very well in this is all of the confusion with messages being delivered back and forth, some of which are carried out too late, and some of which are ignored entirely. Tushin is ordered to retreat, but he doesn't hear the order and just continues firing and doing what he's doing. So this is the section that we have now, and it's a great piece of writing, so here we go. Tushin's battery had been forgotten, and only at the very end of the action did Prince Bagration, still hearing the cannonade in the center, send his orderly staff officer, and later Prince Andrew also, to order the battery to retire as quickly as possible. When the supports attached to Tushin's battery had been moved away in the middle of the action by someone's order, the battery had continued firing and was not only captured by the French because the enemy could not surmise that anyone could have the effrontery to continue firing from 4 quite undefended guns. On the contrary, the energetic action of that battery led the French to suppose that here, in the center, the main Russian forces were concentrated. Twice they had attempted to attack this point, but on each occasion had been driven back by grape shot from the 4 isolated guns on the hillock. Soon after Prince Bagration had left him, Tushin had succeeded in setting fire to Schöngraben. Look at them scurrying. It's burning. To see the smoke. Fine, grand. Look at the smoke, exclaimed the artillerymen, brightening up. All the guns, without waiting for orders, were being fired in the direction of the conflagration. As if urging each other on, the soldiers cried at each shot, "Fine, that's good! Look at it! Grand!" The fire, fanned by the breeze, was rapidly spreading. The French columns that had advanced beyond the village went back, but as though in revenge for this failure, the enemy placed 10 guns to the right of the village and began firing them at Tushin's battery. In their childlike glee, aroused by the fire and their luck in successfully cannonading the French, our artillerymen only noticed this battery when 2 balls, and then 4 more, fell among our guns, one knocking over 2 horses, and another tearing off a munition wagon driver's leg. Their spirits, once roused, were however not diminished, but only changed character. The horses were replaced by others from a reserve gun carriage, the wounded were carried away, and the 4 guns were turned against the 10-gun battery. Tushin's companion officer had been killed at the beginning of the engagement, and within an hour, 17 of the 40 men of the guns' crews had been disabled, but the artillerymen were still as merry and lively as ever. Twice they noticed the French appearing below them, and then they fired grapeshot at them. Little Tushin, moving feebly and awkwardly, kept telling his orderly to "refill my pipe for that one," and then, scattering sparks from it, ran forward, shading his eyes with his small hand to look at the French. "Smack at 'em, lads," he kept saying, seizing the guns by the wheels and working the screws himself. Amid the smoke, deafened by the incessant reports which always made him jump, Tushin, not taking his pipe from his mouth, ran from gun to gun, now aiming, now counting the charges, now giving orders about replacing dead or wounded horses and harnessing fresh ones, and shouting in the feeble voice so high-pitched and irresolute. His face grew more and more animated. Only when a man was killed or wounded did he frown and turn away from the sight, shouting angrily at the men who, as is always the case, hesitated about lifting the injured or dead. The soldiers, for the most part, handsome fellows, and, as is always the case in an artillery company, a head and shoulders taller and twice as broad as their officer, all looked at their commander like children in an embarrassing situation, and the expression on his face was invariably reflected on theirs. Owing to the terrible uproar and the necessity for concentration and activity, Tushin did not experience the slightest unpleasant sense of fear, and the thought that he might be killed or badly wounded never occurred to him. On the contrary, he became more and more elated. It seemed to him that it was a very long time ago, almost a day, since he had first seen the enemy and fired the first shot, and that the corner of the field he stood on was well known and familiar ground. Though he thought of everything, considered everything, and did everything the best of officers could do in his position, he was in a state akin to feverish delirium or drunkenness. From the deafening sounds of his own guns around him, the whistle and thud of the enemy's cannonballs, from the flushed and perspiring faces of the crews bustling round the guns, from the sight of the blood of men and horses, from the little puffs of smoke on the enemy's side, always followed by a ball flying past and striking the earth, a man, a gun, or a horse. From the sight of all these things, a fantastic world of his own had taken possession of his brain, and at that moment afforded him pleasure. The enemy's guns were in his fancy not guns, but pipes, from which occasional puffs were blown by an invisible smoker. "There, he's puffing again," muttered Tushin to himself, as a small cloud rose from the hill and was borne in a streak to the left by the wind. "Now look out for the ball. We'll throw it back." "What do you want, your honor?" asked an artilleryman standing close by, who heard him muttering. "Nothing, only a shell," he answered. "Come along, Matvievna," he said to himself. Matvievna was the name his fancy gave to the farthest gun of the battery, which was large and of an old pattern. The French swarming round their guns seemed to him like ants. In that world, the handsome drunkard number 1 of the second gun's crew was Uncle. Tushin looked at him more often than anyone else, and took delight in his every movement. The sound of musketry at the foot of the hill, now diminishing, now increasing, seemed like someone's breathing. He listened intently to the ebb and flow of these sounds. "Ah, breathing again, breathing," he muttered to himself. He imagined himself as an enormously tall, powerful man who was throwing cannonballs at the French with both hands. "Now then, Matveevna, dear old lady, don't let me down," he was saying as he moved from the gun when a strange, unfamiliar voice called above his head, "Captain Tushin! Captain Tushin!" Tushin turned round in dismay. It was the staff officer who had turned him out of the booth at Grunth. He was shouting in a gasping voice, "Are you mad? You have twice been ordered to retreat, and you—" "Why are they down on me?" thought Tushin, looking in alarm at his superior. "I don't," he muttered, holding up 2 fingers to his cap. But the staff officer did not finish what he wanted to say. A cannonball flying close to him caused him to duck and bend over his horse. He paused, and just as he was about to say something more, another ball stopped him. He turned his horse and galloped off. "Retire! All to retire!" he shouted from a distance. The soldiers laughed. A moment later, an adjutant arrived with the same order. It was Prince Andrew. The first thing he saw on riding up to the space where Tushin's guns were stationed was an unharnessed horse with a broken leg that lay screaming piteously beside the harnessed horses. Blood was gushing from its leg as from a spring. Among the limbers lay several dead men. One ball after another passed over as he approached, and he felt a nervous shudder run down his spine. But the mere thought of being afraid roused him again. "I cannot be afraid," thought he, and dismounted slowly among the guns. He delivered the order and did not leave the battery. He decided to have the guns removed from their positions and withdrawn in his presence. Together with Tushin, stepping across the bodies and under a terrible fire from the French, he attended to the removal of the guns. "A staff officer was here a minute ago but skipped off," said an artilleryman to Prince Andrew. "Not like your honor." Prince Andrew said nothing to Tushin. They were both so busy as to seem not to notice one another. When, having limbered up the only 2 cannon that remained uninjured out of the 4, they began mowing down the hill, one shattered gun and 1 unicorn were still behind, Prince Andrew rode up to Tushin. "Well, till we meet again," he said, holding out his hand to Tushin. "Goodbye, my dear fellow," said Tushin. "Dear soul, goodbye, my dear fellow." And for some unknown reason, tears suddenly filled his eyes. Okay, I love this scene. It gets so much of the heart of what makes Tolstoy just so incredible as a writer. You not only have just a wonderful characterization, you have Tushin right here in the thick of it, in the heart of the battle, and cannonballs are flying every which way. An officer comes riding over, tells him to retreat. The French are dropping shots at him, they're retreating. And we have this feeble, weak, sort of delirious old man who, or maybe not an old man, but this delirious man who's going around pretending that he's filling his cannons not with cannonballs but with pipeweed, who's just in a world of his own. And it is ultimately because of Tushin's activities that the battle is won. Another reason I love this scene is because it gets to the very heart of Tolstoy's theme, which is that there is no accounting for the movement of great migrations of people. There's no accounting for history by simply looking at the actions of great men. Rather, Tolstoy claims it's in all of the little actions of individuals, of accidents, of people not knowing things. It's all of these that ultimately turn the wheels of human history. And here we have an example of that. Tushin doesn't get the order to retreat, and because he doesn't get the order, because he just decides on his own incentive to keep on firing grape shot, that the battle is ultimately won and the Russians move ahead. It's just these little moments here that make all the difference. The realistic details in the battle are just unparalleled. You can absolutely tell that this was written by someone who had experience in combat. If you imagine maybe how they would turn this into a movie, you could easily imagine the dramatic music and you could imagine the heroic actions and the men shouting to each other. But when we read the scene, all that takes place on the outer edge. And what we have is this idea almost of calm, like the calm in the middle of the storm. What's more, this is an absolutely horrifying, dangerous situation to be on. and yet the mood that he captures is one of this lighthearted gaiety. And then I just love the beautiful, ambiguous ending that we have to the scene, that we have Prince Andrew running up and he and Tushin busy themselves, and then Tushin's eyes fill with tears when they meet one another. Maybe that's all the repressed emotion that he hasn't really allowed himself to experience prior to that moment. Maybe it's simply because Prince Andrew has paid attention and shared in this moment with him, and they're experiencing something that is almost beyond the ability to express. Whatever it is, I love it. It fits the scene so well. And so much of War and Peace is like that. Just these beautiful moments of beautiful characters and this absolutely unparalleled attention to detail, setting, and theme. So I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope that in 2026 you might also have a chance to read War and Peace. Hi guys, thank you so much for watching that. If you enjoyed that, go ahead and consider subscribing to my channel or also following me on Substack. And if you really like what I do, you might also consider checking out my book, Cheers! Around the World in 80 Toasts, a compendium of all the different ways to toast around the world. Thank you so much. Happy reading.